The cursed Mickey film in the vault. There are rules for a reason. We tell ourselves that to navigate the predictable currents of life. Don't touch the hot stove. Look both ways before you cross the street. Simple instructions for a simple reality. But there are other rules. Older rules. The kind that aren't written down in any employee handbook or safety manual. They're whispered in break rooms after the sun has set. They're shared in knowing glances between the old-timers who have seen things the new hires, with their bright eyes and corporate optimism, can't yet comprehend. When you work for a place that trades in dreams, a place built on the bedrock of a specific, curated joy, you learn that the shadows cast by all that manufactured light are longer and deeper than anywhere else on Earth. I worked there for 7 years. Not in the parks, not as one of the smiling faces ushering you onto a ride, but behind the scenes. In the archives, a climate-controlled tomb where stories went to be cataloged, sanitized, and occasionally buried. And in the archives, we had a rule. It was the most important one, the one that everyone knew but no one ever explained. Never look for the fourth one. Never speak its name. Never, ever, acknowledge its existence. Most of us were happy to comply. The work was strange enough without inviting trouble. But we weren't most people. We were researchers, historians at heart, and we made a mistake. We thought the rule was just a story, a piece of corporate folklore. We had to break it. And what happened next, what crawled out of the space we created, was worse than we could ever have imagined. This is the protocol for what to do when you discover that the mouse has a shadow it isn't supposed to have. This is the story of the fourth Mickey. To understand the choice we made, you have to understand the place where we worked. The official name was the Corporate Historical Archive, but we all just called it the Vault. It was a multi-level, subterranean complex located directly beneath the main Burbank studio lot. Imagine a library designed by a Cold War bunker architect. Endless corridors of gunmetal gray shelving units, all rising 3 stories high into the gloom. The air was frigid, kept at a constant 50 degrees Fahrenheit with 35% humidity, the perfect conditions to mummify paper and celluloid for eternity. The only sounds were the constant, low hum of the climate control systems and the soft, respectful tread of our own rubber-soled shoes on the polished concrete. It smelled of old paper, vinegar syndrome from decaying film stock, and something else, a faint, clean, chemical smell, like the air after a lightning strike. It was a place where history was not just stored, but sedated. My job title was Senior Archival Researcher. It sounds grander than it was. In reality, I was the custodian of memory. I spent my days verifying acquisition dates, digitizing fragile concept sketches from the 1930s, and ensuring that the narrative the company presented to the world was backed by a perfectly ordered, perfectly sanitized historical record. It was quiet, meticulous work. I found a certain peace in it. My partner in this quiet endeavor was Alex. If I was the custodian, Alex was the archaeologist. He was brilliant, a walking encyclopedia of animation history, but he was also pathologically obsessive. His workstation wasn't neat and ordered like mine. It was a controlled explosion of post-it notes, cross-reference books on folklore and early cinematic techniques, and printouts of obscure documents with certain phrases circled in red ink. While I was content to catalog what was given to me, Alex was a digger. He believed that the company's true history, the raw and dangerous magic of its inception, wasn't in the pristine, board-approved documents. He believed it was in the gaps, in the redacted lines, the mislabeled files, the ghost in the machine artifacts that every massive archive inevitably accumulates. He was looking for the footnotes that told the real story. And that's how we stumbled upon the rule. It was during our first week 7 years ago. We were being given the grand tour by the vault's grizzled old dragon, a man named Frank. Frank had started in the mailroom in the 1950s and had been managing the film archives since the late 60s. He had hands stained with the faint traces of chemicals used to clean film reels, and eyes that held decades of studio secrets. He moved through the shelves not like an employee, but like a warden. He brought us to Bay 7, Section C. High on the top shelf, almost touching the industrial ceiling, was a row of unassuming gray metal film canisters. They looked older than the rest, their labels yellowed and written on a manual typewriter. The labels read, Animation Tests, 1928 to 1930. Everything you need to know about the beginning is right here, Frank said, his voice a low rumble that was perfectly at home in the silent vault. He pointed a thick, steady finger upwards. Takes 1, 2, and 3, the foundational stuff, the stuff that worked. That's the Trinity. He tapped 3 fingers against his chest. Remember that. Alex, true to form, tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. Just 3? He asked, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor. That's a low number for animation tests. There's usually dozens. What about take 4? The change in Frank was instantaneous and terrifying. It wasn't just that he stopped smiling. The warmth in the air around him seemed to evaporate. His folksy, grandfatherly demeanor collapsed into something hard and cold. His eyes, which had been crinkled with good humor, became flat, opaque. He didn't look at Alex. He didn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the concrete floor as if it held some awful memory. There is no take 4, he said. His voice dropped half an octave, losing its folksy drawl and taking on a sharp, definitive edge. There never was. There are 3. Always 3. Look at the boss's design. He held up his hand and drew a shape in the air with his finger. A large circle, then 2 smaller circles on top. 1, 2, 3. The most recognizable silhouette on the planet. 3 circles. It's foundational geometry. It's stable. He lowered his hand and finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over both of us. It was a look of profound warning, a warning that went far beyond a simple workplace directive. You look at the old Technicolor process. 3 color strips. Red, green, blue. The rule of 3. You look at the classic trio of characters. Mickey, Donald, Goofy. 3. It's a powerful, stable thing. It's a lock. Don't go looking to find a 4th key. Don't go looking to make it unstable. Don't ask about it. Don't search for it. Don't even think about it too hard. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the freezing air. There is no take 4. And with that, he turned and walked away down the long corridor, his footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the hum of the vault. The conversation was over. Permanently. For 5 years we let it sleep. The warning had been effective. The work was demanding, and the archives held plenty of other, safer mysteries to occupy Alex's hungry mind. But the seed Frank had planted was there, dormant in the back of our minds. A question mark hanging over the very foundation of the company we were tasked to document. An itch we were disciplined enough not to scratch. The first scratch came accidentally. We were digitizing old architectural blueprints for the main animation building from 1935. It was tedious work, scanning massive, crumbling sheets of paper. I was about to file a floor plan for the 2nd story when Alex leaned over my shoulder, his finger tapping on a small, unlabeled space. "What's this room?" he asked. I zoomed in on the scan. It was a small, windowless office tucked away between the ink and paint department and a stairwell. The designation, written in tiny, precise letters, read, Studio 4. "Ha!" I said. "Never seen that on any modern floor plans." Must have been knocked down to expand the hallway or something. Maybe, Alex said, but he already had that look in his eye, that feverish glint. He spent the rest of the night pulling every subsequent architectural plan for that building. On the plans from 1938 onward, Studio 4 was gone. But the hallway wasn't wider. The surrounding rooms weren't bigger. The wall was just thicker. The space hadn't been repurposed. It had been absorbed, sealed over, walled up and forgotten. The second clue came almost a year later. We were going through early shipping manifests from a warehouse in New York, cross-referencing them with the studio's initial inventory logs from 1928. It was the definition of mundane. Crates of paper, barrels of ink. And then, on a manifest from November 5, 1928, Alex found it. Item 3, animation desk, oak. Quantity 3, signed for by Roy Disney. And directly below it, Item 4, animation desk, oak. Quantity 1, signed for by Alastair Finch. Alastair Finch, Alex whispered, his voice filled with reverence. Finch was a legend, one of the original animators, a reclusive genius who was instrumental in developing the fluid, lively style that defined the early shorts. He had left the studio abruptly in 1934, health reasons, and was never heard from again. We checked the studio's internal inventory log for that same week. The 3 desks signed for by Roy Disney were there, listed and assigned to animators. The 4th desk, the one signed for by Alastair Finch, was nowhere. It had been delivered. It had been signed for. And then it had vanished from the paper trail completely. It was a ghost asset. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that turned our quiet curiosity into a dangerous obsession, was the journal. Alastair Finch's journal. It was part of a recent acquisition from his estranged grandniece. A small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with notes on drawing techniques, complaints about deadlines, and beautiful, intricate sketches of birds. We were tasked with digitizing it. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. But then we reached the entries for October 1929. The neat, careful handwriting started to degrade. It became jagged, frantic. The pressure of the pen nib had torn through the delicate paper in places. And then we found the entry that changed everything. I remember the silence as we read the scanned page on my monitor, the words glowing in the dim light of the vault. October 29th. He showed me the 4th iteration today. It is not the creature from the Oswald shorts. It is not Mortimer. It is not the Mickey we are refining. It is something else. It moves when I am not looking at the page. The flicker in your peripheral vision, he says. That's where it lives. Walt calls it a conceptual resonance, a new way to animate, to breathe life not just into the drawing but into the idea behind it. But the life it breathes is wrong. Feels cold. The smile is too wide. It knows things it shouldn't. He told me to lock it away, to forget it, to never speak of it. But how do you forget something that you feel watching you from the ink itself? My blood ran cold. I looked at Alex. He was pale, his mouth slightly agape. Beneath the entry was a single, hasty drawing. It wasn't a character. It was a symbol, a circle. And inside the circle, another circle. And another. 3 concentric circles like a target. But it didn't feel like a target. Felt like a ward. A prayer in graphite, sketched by a terrified hand. Alex was the first to speak. His voice a hushed, trembling whisper of pure discovery. Conceptual resonance, my God. Do you know what this means? He wasn't just making a cartoon. He was trying to create a modern egregore, a tulpa, a friendly spirit born from the ink and the collective joy of the audience. He was practicing a form of graphic magic. He was scared, Alex, I said, my own voice tight. Read his words. The life it breathes is wrong. It knows things it shouldn't. He was terrified. He said to lock it away. Because he was a pioneer on the edge of a breakthrough he didn't understand. Alex countered, standing up, his eyes now blazing with an energy that scared me. He began pacing in the narrow aisle between the shelves. This is a missing piece of art history, a revolutionary animation technique that was buried because it was too effective, too powerful. We're not just archivists, we're historians. We have a duty to uncover it, to acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. The word hung in the cold, still air. It echoed Frank's warning from all those years ago. Never, ever acknowledge its existence. I looked from the terror-filled words in the journal to the obsessive fire in my partner's eyes. Every instinct in my body, every bit of caution I possessed, was screaming at me to stop, to close the book, delete the scan, and bury this memory so deep in the vault that no one would ever find it again. But Alex was right about one thing. We were the only two people on Earth who could piece this together. We had the access. We had the knowledge. We had found the blueprints, the manifest, and the confession. It was our discovery, our story. My caution wrestled with my own latent curiosity, the part of me that, like Alex, wanted to know the truth behind the curtain. And in the end, my caution lost. Okay, I said, the word feeling like a betrayal of my own senses. Okay, what's the next step? Alex stopped pacing and smiled, a wide, triumphant grin. The next step, he said, is we find it. We find take 4. We decided right then and there, in the sterile silence of that underground tomb, to break the one unbreakable rule. We would find and we would acknowledge the fourth Mickey. And with that single decision, spoken into the dead air of the vault, we sealed our fate. The real work and the real horror was about to begin. Our decision to break the rule echoed in the sterile silence of the vault. It felt like a physical thing, a bell struck in a vacuum, waiting for the air to rush back in so its sound could finally be heard. For days we spoke of nothing else. Alistair Finch's journal became our Bible, his terrified words our gospel. We cross-referenced every name, every date, every cryptic mention of wrong geometry. Alex's obsession had now completely consumed him, and my fear had been supplanted by a grim, magnetic pull towards the abyss he was determined to open. We had to find the physical object, the take 4 that Frank had denied, that the records had erased, and that Alistair Finch had been sacrificed to contain. Our search began with the clues we had: Studio 4 and the Phantom Animation Desk. If you were going to hide a cursed object, you wouldn't file it neatly on a shelf. You would put it somewhere forgotten, somewhere off the books, somewhere damp and dark, where history goes not to be preserved, but to decay. This logic led us to a section of the archives we rarely, if ever, entered: the subbasement. It wasn't officially part of our domain. It was a single, cavernous chamber beneath the lowest level of the vault, accessible only by a rattling, cage-like service elevator in a forgotten corner. This wasn't a place of preservation. It was a tomb for obsolete technology, a graveyard of iron and steel. Ranks of dead projectors stood like silent sentinels. Massive, rusted Moviola and Steinbeck editing machines sat inert, their screens dark, their foot pedals frozen. The air down there was different. The clean, cold, chemical scent of the upper levels was replaced by something thick, damp, and metallic. The smell of rust, stagnant water, and ozone. We spent 2 days searching that iron crypt, our flashlights cutting feeble beams through the oppressive dark. We moved between hulking metal carcasses, the silence broken only by our own breathing and the drip, drip, drip of condensation from an overhead pipe. I was ready to give up, to chalk this up as a dead end. But Alex was relentless. He was following a logic I couldn't grasp, tapping on walls, measuring floor space against the old blueprints of the building above. "It would have been right here," he muttered, his voice muffled by the gloom. He was standing in a far corner, a space almost completely blocked by a collapsed rack of rusted film reels. Studio 4 was directly above this spot. If Finch wanted to hide the desk or what was in the desk, this is where he'd do it. It took us 3 hours of backbreaking work to move the collapsed shelving. It screeched in protest, the sound of tortured metal echoing through the basement. And behind it, nestled in a small alcove in the concrete foundation, was the wall. It was different from the surrounding foundation. The concrete was smoother, a slightly different color. And set into its center was what we had been looking for. It was a small, heavy-duty fireproof safe about 2 feet square. It was old, from the 20s or 30s, and built of thick, black iron. It was not on any inventory list we had ever seen. The face of it was completely blank, devoid of a manufacturer's mark or logo, save for a single, small, stamp number just above the combination dial. The number 4. My heart, which had been a steady rhythm of exertion, began to pound with a sick, heavy beat. This was it. This was the lockbox for the thing Finch was so afraid of. It felt wrong to even look at it, like a monolithic tombstone warning us away. Alex, however, looked like a pilgrim who had just reached the end of his journey. He ran a hand over the cold iron, his expression one of pure, ecstatic reverence. Cracking it was his domain. I watched, holding the flashlight steady, as he worked. He didn't use a stethoscope or any fancy movie tricks. He used Finch's journal. He believed the combination wouldn't be random numbers. It would be part of the ritual, part of the magic. He used dates from the journal, page numbers, the number of circles Finch had drawn in the margins. It took him 2 full nights of painstaking, obsessive work, the only sounds being the soft clicks of the dial and Alex's low, constant muttering. On the 3rd night, after hours of methodical turning, there was a loud, resonant thunk that echoed in the small space. The handle, which had been frozen for what must have been 90 years, moved under his hand. He pulled the heavy iron door open. It swung outward on a silent, well-oiled hinge. The air that escaped from within was cold and smelled faintly of celluloid and something else, a strange, sweet, cloying smell like burnt sugar and static electricity. Inside, there was no gold, no revolutionary documents, no hidden confession. There was just a single object, resting on a bed of what looked like black velvet. It was a small film canister, smaller than a standard 35mm reel. It was made of a dark, heavy metal, not the usual aluminum. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so. And the label, affixed to its center, was typewritten and chillingly simple. Audition. Take 4. We stood there in the beam of my flashlight, the open safe like a wound in the wall. The silence was absolute. The dripping had stopped. Even the hum of the world above seemed to have faded away. I found my voice first, a dry whisper. "Alex, we found it." The rule was to never acknowledge it. "We've acknowledged it. Let's close this door, put the shelves back, and never speak of this again. We know the truth. That has to be enough." Alex slowly picked up the canister. It seemed heavier than it should have been, his arm straining slightly. He turned it over and over in his hands. He looked at me, his face illuminated by the harsh light, his eyes wide and burning with a fever I didn't recognize. "Enough? This isn't the truth. This is just the container for the truth. To acknowledge doesn't mean finding the box. It means seeing what's inside. We haven't broken the rule. Not really. Not yet." He held the canister out. "An audition needs an audience. That's the entire point. Alistair Finch was its first audience. We have to be its second. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, against the palpable wrongness that was radiating from that small metal can, I found myself nodding. He was right. We had come this far. To turn back now would be its own kind of madness, a lifetime of wondering. We had to see what they were so afraid of. We had to give the ghost its audition. Later that night, long after the studio had emptied out, we took the canister to a place of judgment. One of the old, private screening rooms on the main lot. It was a plush, silent room, reserved for top executives. A place where dreams were greenlit or crushed with a quiet nod. The room was steeped in the power of the gaze. We threaded the strange, small-gauge film onto the vintage projector, the same model that would have been used in 1929. The clicking of the sprockets as Alex fed the celluloid through the gate sounded unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence of the room. Each click was like a nail being hammered into a coffin. I sank into one of the deep velvet chairs, my hands clammy, my mouth dry. "Alex," I started one last plea. He didn't look at me. He was focused on the projector, his face a mask of concentration. "We can't be cowards now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "History is for the brave." He flipped the switch. The projector whirred to life. A harsh, bright cone of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. The leader film counted down on the screen 54:32. The screen flickered. A hand-drawn title card appeared, written in a bouncy, familiar font, but the ink looked slightly smeared, wet almost. Mickey's audition. Then he appeared. For the first 3 or 4 seconds, it almost looked normal. It was a very early, crude version of the character we all knew. The rubber-hosed limbs, the pie-cut eyes, the simple circular body. He was bouncing on the balls of his feet, a simple animation loop, just as he did in Steamboat Willie. But something was immediately and profoundly wrong. The movements were too fluid, impossibly fluid. There was a sense of weight and three-dimensionality to the character that hand-drawn animation from that era simply should not have had. It didn't look like a series of drawings being projected. It looked like a silhouette of something real, filmed through some strange, distorting filter. The audio track kicked in. It was a simple, plinking piano tune, the kind you'd expect. But it was slightly, deliberately out of key. The melody seemed to wander, creating a subtle, nauseating dissonance that set my teeth on edge. Then, the character on screen stopped bouncing. He came to a complete, sudden halt in the center of the frame. And then he turned his head. It was a slow, unnatural, liquid motion. He turned to face the screen, to face us. As he turned, the pie cuts in his eyes, those little triangular marks that give the character life and direction, vanished. They bled away into the black, leaving 2 stark, perfectly round, empty circles, pits of pure ink. And then he smiled. It was not the cheerful, mischievous grin from the posters. This smile was wider. It stretched the boundaries of the face, pulling the cheeks into taut, unnatural lines that seemed to go too far, curving into the lines of the head itself. It was a predator's smile. It was the smile of hungry, ancient amusement. He just stood there, staring. The plinking piano music devolved into a series of random, discordant notes, like a frustrated child banging on the keys. He didn't move a muscle, but I could feel him moving. I felt his gaze, those empty black holes, sweeping over me. It wasn't a physical sensation. It was a feeling of intimate, violating psychic pressure, a cold probe sliding behind my eyes. And then a phantom memory bloomed in my mind, the image of a cold, dark room, the smell of ozone, and a voice whispering my name in a language made of static and clicks. It wasn't my memory, but it was in my head. Beside me, I could hear Alex's breathing, shallow and hitched. He was completely still, his face a pale mask in the flickering light. The thing on the screen raised one white-gloved hand. It didn't bend at the elbow or the wrist like a cartoon. It just flowed upwards, the black limb elongating slightly. He held his hand up, palm out, and he waved. A slow, deliberate, mocking gesture. A wave that said, "I see you. I acknowledge you." The film shuddered, bleached out to pure, blinding white, and then the tail end began to flap rhythmically against the projector gate, a sound like a frantic, trapped bird. The whirring of the projector fan was the only sound in the universe. We sat in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a minute. The silence the film left behind was heavier, more profound than the silence that had come before. It felt accusatory. Finally, Alex cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Well," he said, his voice a strained, brittle whisper. "That was unsettling." Unsettling? I finally found my voice, but it came out as a ragged croak. "Alex, that wasn't an animation. That wasn't Alistair Finch. That was something else." "What was that feeling?" "When he looked at us." "I don't know," he admitted, finally breaking his gaze from the white screen and turning to me, his eyes dark and wide. Static pressure. A headache. Just an effect of the visuals. He was trying to rationalize, to put it back in a box. But his voice lacked any conviction. Let's get out of here." We packed up the film, the metal canister now feeling colder and heavier than before. We didn't speak as we left the screening room, locking the door behind us. We walked out into the cool California night, the familiar lights of the studio lot now looking somehow alien and menacing. We tried to believe it was over. We had broken the rule, seen the ghost, and we could go back to our quiet lives in the archives. We were so wrong. The audition wasn't the performance. It was the invitation, and something in the darkness had just accepted. The first 24 hours after the audition were a study in denial. A frantic, silent agreement between Alex and myself to pretend that nothing had happened. We went to work, we filed our reports, we drank coffee in the break room and made small talk about deadlines. We deliberately avoided the sub-basement. We tried to bury the memory of those black, staring eyes and that predatory smile under a mountain of mundane paperwork. We told ourselves it was just a film, a clever, disturbing, experimental piece of animation designed to provoke a reaction. And it had worked. We were spooked. That's all it was. We were trying to force reality back into its old shape, to smooth over the crack we had made. But the seed of that wrongness had been planted in the fertile soil of our attention. And in the silent, fluorescent-lit world of the archives, it began to sprout in the cracks of our reality. The glitches started small. So small you could easily, desperately, dismiss them as tricks of the light or products of a tired, overstimulated mind. The first one happened to me 2 days after the screening. I was walking through the animation building, in one of the few corridors with windows that faced the park. It was a bright, sunny afternoon. I paused, looking out at the distant, cheerful spires of the castle, the perfect illusion of happiness. In the main plaza below, a crowd of families was gathered around one of the costumed Mickey mascots. The character was waving, posing for photos. And then, for a split second, it stopped. Everyone around it continued to move, laughing and talking in a blur of motion. But the mascot stood perfectly, unnaturally still. Its head, the large, smiling, iconic head, was tilted at a sharp 90-degree angle, a physical impossibility for the human performer inside. The plastic eyes of the mask were fixed directly on my window, 3 stories up. I felt a jolt of pure, cold shock. I blinked, and just like that, the illusion was restored. The character was back to waving and hugging children as if nothing had happened. My heart was hammering. I told myself it was a trick of the angle, a distortion through the thick glass. A lie. Later that day, I was in the break room, trying to calm my nerves with a cup of coffee. I poured in the cream and stirred it absently, my mind elsewhere. I glanced down. The white cream swirling in the black liquid had formed a familiar pattern. 3 circles. Perfect, iconic silhouette. For a moment it brought a flicker of the old simple comfort the image used to bring me. But then, as I watched, the pattern warped. The 2 smaller circles, the ears, began to droop and elongate, the lines sagging downwards like melting wax. The larger circle of the face widened, stretched, the edges pulling into that hungry, predatory smile from the film. It was there for less than a second, a grotesque caricature in my coffee cup, and then it was just a random swirl of cream again. I gasped and dropped the mug. It shattered in the sink. I stood there for a long time, my hand shaking, staring at the porcelain shards. I tried to talk to Alex about it. He was my partner in this, the only other person in the world who would understand. But he was already changing. His usual manic, creative energy had collapsed inward, replaced by a sullen, haunted exhaustion. He sat at his desk for hours, staring at a blank computer screen, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. "I'm seeing things, Alex," I told him, my voice a low whisper so no one else in the vault could hear. "Little things that are off. In the park. In my coffee. It's like the film is leaking out." He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the blank monitor. "You're just spooked," he muttered, his voice flat and lifeless. "It's suggestion. The power of suggestion. We watched a scary movie, and now we're seeing monsters in the closet. It'll pass. We just have to ignore it." But I knew it was more than that. The fabric of the world, which had felt solid and reliable my whole life, now felt thin, brittle, like a projection on a screen that was starting to flicker at the edges. The auditory hallucinations began a few days after that. They were always subtle, always at the very edge of hearing, designed to make you question your own senses. I'd be walking down a long, empty corridor in the vault and hear the faint, high-pitched giggle of a cartoon character from around the corner. But it was hollow, devoid of any joy. I'd be walking to my car in the empty parking garage at night and hear the unmistakable sound of oversized shoes shuffling on the pavement just behind me. Every time I'd spin around, my heart leaping into my throat, there was nothing there. Just rows of silent cars under the buzzing orange lights. The worst was the whisper. It would come when I was alone, in the dead quiet of my apartment. My name, spoken in that static-laced, inhuman voice from the phantom memory I'd had in the screening room. A voice made of clicks and radio interference. It was a violation, a hook planted directly in my brain. Alex was deteriorating faster. His denial had shattered, and what lay beneath was pure terror. He stopped coming to work a week after the screening. He didn't call in sick. He just vanished. I called his cell phone over and over. Most calls went straight to voicemail. Twice he picked up. I would say his name, and there would be no response, just the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing on the other end of the line, as if he were hiding from something in the room with him. After 2 days of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to his apartment. It was a small second-floor unit in a nondescript complex miles from the studio. His car was in its designated spot. I went up and knocked on the door. No answer. I pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear something inside. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I used the spare key he'd given me for emergencies. "Alex," I called out as I opened the door. "It's me." His apartment was a disaster zone. But it wasn't a normal mess. It was the mess of a mind coming undone. Papers, books, and DVDs were strewn everywhere. And on the walls, on every available surface, were drawings. Done in thick, black marker. Circles. Hundreds of them. The rule of 3, insignia, the Mickey Mouse head silhouette drawn over and over and over again. They were scrawled across the walls, over his windows blocking out the light, even on the screen of his television. It was a madman's attempt at building a fortress of symbols. Wards against evil. Alex himself was huddled in the far corner of the living room, his back to me. He was pale and gaunt, his clothes rumpled as if he hadn't slept in days. He was holding a jagged shard from a broken dinner plate, and with it, he was meticulously carving the 3-circle shape into the hardwood floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Alex, my God, what's happening? I took a step towards him. He flinched and looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a frantic, unblinking terror I had only seen in horror movies. They darted around the room, never settling, as if watching things I couldn't see. They have to be perfect, he whispered, his voice a dry, cracking rasp. The ratio has to be perfect. 1 to .618. The golden ratio. It's the only thing that keeps the lines straight. What lines, Alex? What are you talking about? He looked at me, a flicker of the old Alex shining through the fear. The lines of the world, he said, his voice desperate. The straight lines, the perspective lines, the lines that hold everything together. He makes them bend. He comes in through the curves, the wrong curves, the smile, the ears that aren't ears. He's a thing of wrong geometry, and he's trying to rewrite everything, to make it all look like him. That night, I went home, my mind reeling from what I had seen. Couldn't sleep. I finally drifted into a shallow, feverish doze, and the dream came. It wasn't a normal dream. It was lucid, hyper-real. I was back in the plush, velvet seats of the private screening room. But this time I was on the screen. I was the one trapped in the flickering celluloid, living out my day in black and white, my movements jerky and repetitive. And in the audience, there was only one patron. A stark black silhouette sitting in the center of the theater. The 4th Mickey. He wasn't moving, but the entire room was subtly warping around him. The plush red seats twisting into grotesque shapes, the ornate walls breathing slowly in and out. I was the entertainment, and I could feel his amusement, his cold, detached satisfaction. He was the audience now, and my life was the show. I woke up with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs as if it was trying to escape my body. I sat bolt upright, gasping for air in the darkness of my bedroom. My eyes darted around the room, searching the familiar shadows for any sign of movement. Everything was still. Everything was normal. Then my eyes adjusted to the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. And I saw it. On the wall opposite my bed, a wall that had been blank when I went to sleep, there was a drawing. It was crude, childlike, drawn with a single, unbroken, greasy black line. It looked like it had been drawn with a crayon made of shadow and soot. It was a smiling mouse figure. The lines were wrong. The curves were too deep. The smile was too wide. The glitches were over. The haunting was no longer a subtle suggestion or a psychological trick. He was no longer just a memory from a film. He had crossed over. He had followed me home from the screening room. He had followed me out of my dreams. He was in my apartment. He was in my mind. And he was just getting started. The drawing on my bedroom wall was a declaration of war. It was the entity planting its flag in my reality. The glitches were no longer passive, subjective experiences I could attempt to rationalize away. The haunting had breached the perimeter of my own mind and had gained a foothold in the physical world. I didn't sleep in my apartment again. Couldn't. Every shadow seemed to coalesce. Every curve in the furniture seemed to subtly warp when I wasn't looking directly at it. The entity's presence had changed its nature. It was moving beyond psychological terror. It was becoming an invasive, corrupting force. It wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. It was trying to erase things. I began to notice it in the one place I once considered a sanctuary of fact: the archives. The vault was supposed to be a place of immutable history, a library of what was, but now it had become the entity's canvas. I was pulling a file for a documentary producer, one I'd handled 100 times before. It contained publicity stills from the park's opening day in 1955. I distinctly remembered one iconic photograph. A wide shot of Main Street, packed shoulder to shoulder with a jubilant, overwhelming crowd. A sea of smiling faces. But when I slid the 8x10 glossy from its sleeve, it was wrong. The street was still there, the buildings were the same, but the crowd was sparse. There were only a few dozen scattered, lonely-looking people. They stood in small, isolated clusters with vast, empty spaces of pavement between them. The joy was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet, melancholic emptiness. It looked less like a grand opening and more like a dress rehearsal that no one had bothered to attend. My blood ran cold. I frantically pulled up the high-resolution digital scan we had on the server. The scan matched the photograph in my hand. The sea of people I remembered had never existed. A few days later, a more insidious change. I was handling a protected document, an internal memo from 1940, signed by Walt Disney himself. His signature was famous, a piece of corporate art. I knew its loops and swirls by heart. But as I looked at it under the magnifying lamp, something was off. The familiar, rounded, optimistic loops of the W and D were subtly sharpened. The lines were more angular, the curves slightly more severe. It looked predatory, spider-like. It was still recognizably his signature, but it was as if it had been rewritten by a different, colder hand. These were subtle poisons, but they were working. The entity was attacking the foundation, changing the documents, altering the paper trail. It was gaslighting history itself. But the most terrifying violation was yet to come. It happened in the animation cell vault. Cells are the DNA of the company. Each one is a sheet of celluloid bearing a single, hand-painted frame of a character. They are the original physical artwork. I was verifying the inventory of cells from the band concert, one of the first and most beloved color cartoons. I remembered it vividly. Mickey, the proud conductor on the bandstand, being harassed by a persistent bee while Donald Duck tries to derail the performance with his flute. I pulled out a key cell. The moment the band plays the triumphant finale of the William Tell Overture, I held the delicate, precious sheet up to the light table, and I saw it. In the background, amongst the crowd of cartoon onlookers, the rabbits and pigs and dogs in their Sunday best, there was a new face. One I had never seen before. A face with two black, empty pits for eyes and a smile that was far, far too wide for its head. He was just standing there in the back row, perfectly still, watching. He hadn't been there before. I knew it. I knew that cartoon frame by frame. My breath hitched. With trembling hands, I placed the cell back in its protective sleeve and ran to my terminal. I pulled up the official multi-million-dollar digital restoration of the short that we had on our secure servers. I scrubbed to the exact timestamp. He was there. Then, my heart pounding, I pulled out my phone, went to the company's public streaming service, and played the cartoon for the entire world to see. I skipped to the finale, and there he was, a smiling, silent predator, hiding in plain sight. He had always been there. The ink was spreading. He wasn't just haunting me. He was inserting himself into history, overwriting the original memory, not just for me, but for everyone. He was staining the past. The fourth Mickey was performing a retroactive continuity edit on reality itself. My last conversation with Alex was a week after I'd found him in his apartment, carving circles into his floor. The call came late at night, from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer. His voice was a bare whisper, thin and reedy, but it was filled with a terrifying, final clarity. The frantic fear was gone, replaced by the calm of a man who has finally understood the nature of his executioner. "It's a parasite," he said, the words tumbling out without any preamble. "A conceptual parasite. That's what Finch understood. It doesn't exist on its own. It needs a host system. We gave it everything it needed. We gave it a name. We gave it an audience. We fed it our attention. And now it's strong enough to feed itself." "What does it want, Alex?" I pleaded, sinking into a chair. "What is the end goal?" "To be the only one," he rasped. "There can't be three. The rule of three was a lock and we broke it. Now there is four. But four is unstable. He wants to be one. The one true iteration. It's erasing the others. It's correcting the source code. Don't you see? It thinks the original Mickey is a flawed copy, an imperfect draft. And it is the perfected, final version." A noise started in the background of the call. A faint, tinny sound that made every muscle in my body clench. It was the discordant, plinking piano music from the audition film. "Alex, where are you? What is that music? Get out of there!" I yelled into the phone. A long silence. Then, a soft, resigned whisper. "Too late. The circles, they don't hold him anymore. He's here. I can see him at the end of the hall. His breath hitched. He's not drawn right. He's all lines. He's all curves." There was a choked, gurgling sound, then the distinct sound of the phone clattering to the floor. And then, just before the line went dead, I heard it clearly. A high-pitched, triumphant giggle. I never saw Alex again. I called the police, my voice trembling, and filed a missing persons report. They were professional, detached. They investigated his apartment. They found nothing. The hundreds of circles he had carved and drawn were gone. The walls were clean. The floorboards were pristine. All of his frantic warnings had been wiped clean. It was as if he, and all his fear, had never existed at all. They found his car at LAX a few days later, in long-term parking. But there was no record of him ever boarding a flight. He was simply erased. Deleted. I knew I was next. The parasite's focus would now be entirely on me. I was the only other person who had been in the screening room. The only other person who remembered the world as it was before the corrections. I was a loose end, a historical anomaly that needed to be fixed. Fear is a powerful motivator, but so is grief. I couldn't let Alex's erasure be for nothing. I had to understand what we had unleashed. I had to find a weapon. Armed with a growing, desperate dread, I went back to the source. Back to Alastair Finch's journal. There had to be something we had missed. I spent an entire night in the empty vault, under the constant, sterile hum of the fluorescent lights, pouring over every single page. I analyzed every sketch, every doodle, every word. And then, in the final hours before dawn, I found it. Tucked into a small, tight paper pocket on the inside back cover of the journal were 2 pages, folded together and stuck fast. They were brittle with age, the ink faded almost to invisibility. I had to take them to a restoration desk and use a blacklight just to read the frantic, spidery scrawl. It was Alastair Finch's last entry, his confession, his suicide note, and it explained everything. "It's loose," The idea is loose from the ink. Walt was wrong. It is not a spirit of joy we contacted. It is a tulpa, yes, but a hungry one. A being of pure thought, given form by concentrated belief, but we used the wrong language to draw it. The geometry is wrong. It is a thing of angles and curves that do not belong in a stable reality. It is an artist's nightmare given life. A doodle from the margins of a mad god's notebook. We tried to perform the binding again. The rule of 3. It is not just a design principle, I see that now. It is a conceptual lock. A cage made of resonant, stable ideas. 3 notes in a major chord create harmony. 3 acts in a story create resolution. Trinity. Stable. Whole. Perfect. It is a structure designed to contain the instability of the 4th. The aberration. But the binding requires a sacrifice. A permanent anchor in this world to hold the lock in place. One of us had to become the cage. To hold the idea in stasis with our own life force. Walt wanted to do it himself. I wouldn't let him. The world needs his vision. It does not need a frightened artist who drew a door he shouldn't have. I will be the key. I will go into Studio 4. I will take the desk and the film. And I will become the wall that keeps it contained. My last request to him was that the rule be passed down. Never acknowledge the prisoner. Never speak its name. To give it attention is to feed it. To give it an audience is to hand it the key to its cage. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The rule wasn't a superstition. It was the lock on a prison cell. And Alistair Finch wasn't a runaway. He was the prison itself. We hadn't just watched a forgotten film. We had staged a jailbreak. We had taken the key, Alistair's very soul, and undone his sacrifice with our arrogant, academic curiosity. From the far end of the main archive corridor, a sound shattered the silence. A loud, violent crash. One of the heavy, 3-story steel shelves had toppled over, sending a cascade of film canisters and acid-free boxes raining down onto the concrete floor. It was impossible. Those shelves were bolted into the foundation. Then I heard it, coming from the direction of the crash. The soft, deliberate shuffling of oversized shoes, getting closer. And beneath it, a melody, seeping out of the very walls around me. The discordant, plinking piano music from the audition. I dropped the journal. I knew he was here, not as a glitch or a phantom or a smudge on a piece of film. He was coming for the last witness. He was coming to finish the correction. I killed the lights. It was a single, panicked motion-off fist slammed against the master switch for our section of the vault. The humming fluorescent banks overhead died with a collective buzz, plunging the corridor into a disorienting, emergency-lit gloom. The only illumination came from the stark red glow of the exit signs and the weak, yellow safety lights spaced every 50 feet along the floor. The endless rows of steel shelves were transformed into monolithic tombstones, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild animal trying to batter its way out. The shuffling was closer now. It was accompanied by a new sound, a soft, wet, tearing noise, the sound of adhesive being slowly, deliberately, pulled from a wall. I pressed myself flat against the cold steel of a shelf, peering through the narrow gap between 2 rows. Down the main corridor, where the shelf had crashed, a figure was emerging from the deep shadows. It wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a cartoon. It was a nightmare amalgamation of both, a living paradox given form. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, but it was hunched over, its posture conveying a terrifying, coiled energy. Its limbs were long and spindly, perfect black cylinders like rubber hoses from a 1920s animation. But they moved with a horrifying, jointless fluidity, bending at impossible angles. Its torso was a void of pure, matte black that seemed to drink the dim light around it, creating a hole in reality. The only color came from the stark white of its two-button shorts and its pristine, four-fingered gloves. And its head was the true center of the horror. It was perfectly, impossibly round and smooth, like a ball of polished obsidian. The two ears were not attachments, but perfect circles that seemed to be part of the same static, unmoving surface. And the face was a mask of placid, white horror, a canvas dominated by that smile. Wide, thin, and unmoving. It wasn't an expression. It was a feature carved into its being. The black, empty eyes were fixed in my direction. They didn't scan the room. They knew exactly where I was. Took a step. Its oversized yellow shoe made no sound on the concrete, but the air around it warped and shimmered like heat haze. I watched, mesmerized with terror, as the concrete floor beneath its foot seemed to buckle and curve. The straight, perfect lines of the polished tiles bent away from its presence, as if the very geometry of the room was revolted by its existence and was trying to retreat. This was the thing Alistair had described, a being of wrong angles, a living contradiction. I ran. There was no thought, only pure, primal instinct. I turned and fled, my soft-soled shoes silent on the concrete, a ghost fleeing a god. I plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the archives, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear it behind me, its pace unhurried, that soft, rhythmic shuffling echoing in the steel canyons. It wasn't chasing me. It was hurting me. And the music, the plinking, out-of-key piano music was everywhere now. It wasn't coming from a single source. It was seeping out of the very walls, a maddening, discordant soundtrack to my final moments, as if the vault itself was now its instrument. I scrambled up the steel emergency stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my lungs burning. I burst through the heavy fire door and found myself on the main studio lot, out in the cool night air. For a single, glorious second, I felt a surge of hope. I was out of the claustrophobic tomb, out in the open. But the hope died as I saw what had become of the world outside. The kingdom was broken. The studio lot, usually a cheerful, immaculate theme park of creative energy, was twisted into a Boschian landscape. The familiar, friendly architecture was distorted as if seen through a warped lens. The iconic, cartoonish lampposts drooped like wilted flowers, their light a sickly, pale yellow. The main animation building, a monument to decades of dreams, sagged in the middle, its windows looking like weeping, empty eyes. The lines were wrong. Everywhere, the straight, reliable lines of human construction were bent into sickening, unnatural curves. I looked up at the iconic water tower, the studio's proud sigil. It was supposed to have 2 cheerful, round mouse ears. But now there was only one. The other looked as if it had been melted off, a drooping, slagged ruin of steel. The rule of 3, the stable trinity, was being broken everywhere I looked. And in the center of the main plaza, it waited for me. It stood beside the famous Partners statue, the bronze monument where a life-sized, smiling Walt Disney holds hands with his most famous creation. But the bronze Mickey was gone, vanished. In its place, the ink-black entity stood, its pristine white glove resting placidly in Walt's outstretched bronze hand. It had replaced the original. It had corrected the statue to reflect its own truth. It turned its head with that same slow, liquid motion. The unmoving smile seemed to widen, to stretch. It wasn't hunting me anymore. It had won the race. This was the checkmate. And in that moment, looking at that impossible creature standing hand in hand with the company's founder, I finally understood. I understood what Alistair Finch knew, what Alex had realized too late. You can't fight it. You can't shoot an idea. You can't punch a concept. You can't reason with a correction. Alistair had sacrificed himself to contain it, and Alex had been erased by it. To stand and fight was to be deleted. My only option was the one thing they didn't do. I had to run. I had to survive. I had to become a carrier of the original memory, a refugee from a forgotten reality. I had to be a witness. I turned and fled, not looking back. I ran past the warped buildings and the weeping lampposts, the sound of that high-pitched, triumphant giggle echoing from the plaza behind me, chasing me out of the kingdom. I didn't stop running until the sun came up, until the manicured lawns of Burbank had given way to the cracked pavement of the real world, and I was miles away, a world away, from the place where dreams were made and where my own nightmare had been born. I escaped the studio that night, but I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very core, that I did not get away. I've been on the move ever since. I live in cash. I don't stay in one place for more than a few weeks. I can't use my real name, my credit cards, my social security number. I have been, for all intents and purposes, erased. Just like Alex. But I'm still here. A ghost clinging to a version of reality that is fading fast, like an old photograph left out in the sun. I still see him, not the physical creature that stood in the plaza. I see his influence, his corrections, the spreading ink. I'll be in a dusty thrift store in a town I don't know and see a child's toy from the 1950s, a classic Mickey pull toy. But the eyes will be solid black without the friendly pie cuts. I'll find an old comic book in a flea market, and in one panel, his smile will be just a little too wide, the curve of it just a little too cruel. I watched the old cartoons online sometimes, the ones I have memorized frame for frame from my time in the vault. And I see the changes, a flicker in the background, a shadow that lingers too long, a single, almost subliminal frame where the friendly icon is replaced by the predator who wears his face. The ink is still spreading. He won. He broke the rule of 3 and is slowly, methodically, replacing the memory of his predecessor. He's becoming the original, the one true Mickey, and soon the version we all grew up with, the cheerful, harmless friend, will be nothing more than a faulty memory in the minds of a few scattered old people. A phantom limb of a forgotten reality, a story no one believes. I am telling you this as a final warning. I have no idea how much of this transmission will even reach you in its original form. He corrupts information, too. But I have to try. Do not go digging for things that have been deliberately buried. Do not dismiss old rules as simple stories. Some doors are closed for a very good reason. And some smiles are not your friend. We had to break the rule. We had to acknowledge the fourth Mickey. And in doing so, we didn't just unleash a monster. We let the editor into the editing room, and he has decided that the entire story needs a rewrite. Be careful what you watch. Be careful what you remember. And if you ever see a shadow in the shape of a mouse, a shadow with a smile that's just a little too wide, run. I escaped the studio that night, but I know, with a certainty that has become the bedrock of my new existence, that I did not get away. There is no away. Not anymore. The world I fled to is not the one I was born into. This is world now. I'm just a ghost living in it. My life since that night has been a series of non-places. Anonymous motel rooms that smell of bleach and despair, paid for in cash. Burner phones that I use for a week and then snap in half and discard. I eat at all-night diners, always sitting in a booth in the corner, my back to the wall, watching the reflections in the window. I can't form connections. I can't have friends. To know me is to be put on his radar. To love me would be a death sentence. I am a contagion. I am what the intelligence community would call a ghost asset. I have no bank accounts, no credit cards, no digital footprint. I have been, for all intents and purposes, erased. Just like Alex. But unlike him, My heart is still beating. My lungs still draw air. I am a living archive of a dead reality. And that, I've come to believe, is my true curse. Not to be hunted, but to be forced to remember. I don't just run. I look. It's a compulsion, a masochistic pilgrimage. I spend my days sifting through the wreckage of the past, hunting for his corrections, for proof that I'm not insane. I found one piece of proof in an antique mall in rural Pennsylvania. On a dusty shelf, nestled between a rusty tin soldier and a porcelain doll with a cracked face, was a child's toy from the 1950s, a classic Mickey pull toy. I picked it up. The wood was smooth, the paint faded, but the eyes were wrong. They were solid black, glossy, empty voids without the friendly, triangular pie cuts that should have been there. The woman who ran the stall saw me looking at it. She smiled. "Takes you back, doesn't it?" she said. "That smile never changes." And I just stared at her, my blood turning to ice, because the smile on the toy was just a little too wide, the curve of it just a little too cruel. I found another in a box of old comics at a flea market in Arizona. A Walt Disney's Comics and Stories from 1948. The paper smelled of dust and time. I flipped through the pages, and there it was. A single panel where the line work was subtly different, sharper, more aggressive, and in the corner of the panel behind a picket fence was a shadow shaped like him, a detail I know for a fact was never there, a silent observer in a storybook world. But the worst is the films, the digital ghosts. Sometimes, when the loneliness is too much, I sit in a cheap motel room with the lights off and I watch the old cartoons on my laptop. The ones I have memorized frame for frame from my time in the vault. And I see the corruption spreading. It's in the code itself. A single frame in Steamboat Willie where his face is the wrong face. A digital artifact in Fantasia where the shadow of the sorcerer's apprentice elongates into a familiar, horrifying silhouette for a millisecond. These are his fingerprints, his graffiti on the masterpieces of the past. The ink is still spreading. He won. He broke the rule of 3 and is slowly, methodically, replacing the memory of his predecessor. He's not just an urban legend anymore. He's becoming the original, the one true Mickey. And soon, the version we all grew up with, the cheerful, harmless, slightly mischievous friend, will be nothing more than a faulty memory, a phantom limb of a forgotten reality. He is engineering a global Mandela effect, and we are all the test subjects. That feeling you sometimes get, that nagging certainty that the world isn't quite how you remember it, for this one, small, terrifying corner of reality. It's true. I am telling you this as a final warning. This is the last protocol I can offer. I have to believe this transmission can reach you, but I know how he works. He corrupts information. He stains the signal. If there are glitches in this recording, if my voice sounds wrong, if the image flickers, that is not a technical error. That is him trying to edit me out. Do not go digging for things that have been deliberately buried. Do not dismiss old rules as simple stories or corporate folklore. Some doors are closed for a very good reason. Some histories are sealed for the protection of all. And some smiles are not your friend. We had to break the rule. We had to acknowledge the fourth Mickey. And in doing so, we didn't just unleash a monster from a film can. We validated him. We gave a predator the keys to the kingdom, and he has decided that the entire story needs a rewrite with him as the hero. Be careful what you watch. Be careful what you remember. And if you ever see a shadow in the shape of a mouse, a shadow with a smile that's just a little too wide, run. Do not try to understand it. Do not try to capture it. Just run. Thank you for joining us for this protocol. The world is filled with strange and hidden things, and it is our mission here to document them, to understand them, and, when necessary, to warn you about them. If you believe these stories are important, If you believe these warnings need to be preserved, please consider subscribing to the Wilderness Protocol and enabling notifications. It helps ensure that these transmissions can cut through the noise and reach those who need to hear them. Share your own experiences with strange rules, corporate folklore, or altered memories in the comments below. In the static of the modern world, it is more important than ever to compare notes. We read all of them. Stay safe out there, and stay vigilant. End of transmission.